I now have an incredible guest. As you guys know, we have a return guest joining us via Discord, the #1 labor reporter in the nation, award-winning, celebrated, decorated journalist, Alex Press is in the building, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm very honored that Alex Press is here to talk to us about the role that police play in picket lines, both historically and also right now, and how it ties back to the Amazon labor union's actions, Teamsters actions being taken at this very moment. Alex Press, hello.
Hey, Hasan, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
I'm good. I'm a little tired. I got up pretty early to get to that picket line.
Yeah, lazy socialist, doesn't want to wake up early. Classic. What else is new?
It was for a good cause. I was happy to do it.
So, Alex, I'm hearing that there is a lot of labor momentum occurring right now. There's a picket line happening. There's a strike happening. Can you give us a little bit of detail on that? Can you give us some background on what's going on?
Yeah, so 7 different Amazon facilities have strikes right now. So the Teamsters represent I think it's 10 total, and 7 of those are now on strike. At all of these facilities, they're not the giant warehouses. Like JFK 8 is the most well-known one that went with the Teamsters after organizing as the ALU. These are smaller delivery hubs. They're called sort centers. They're usually like in the bigger cities. They're like last mile delivery. In certain ways, they're more strategic because they're those choke points that Amazon has a little more trouble getting around. They're also easier to organize because they're more like 1,000 people working there rather than like 7,000, which is what JFK 8 at Staten Island is. So workers at 7 of these facilities have organized with the Teamsters. I think it's important for people to know it's not that every worker or the majority of workers necessarily at all of these places have organized with the Teamsters. These workers are classified as third-party contractors, so they like technically work for another company, right? So you'll get an Amazon package delivered to your door, and the driver will be wearing an Amazon shirt. He'll be driving an Amazon car, maybe an Amazon branded van, but he might actually be employed by a third party that exists pretty much just to contract out to Amazon. And that's kind of the key of the argument here. It's very clear to the workers, to the Teamsters, to anybody who pays attention to this stuff, that this is a misclassification, that Amazon does this so that they don't have to deal with benefit and the things like workplace discrimination suits and any of the stuff that comes with being an employer. But Amazon says, no, these aren't our employees. It's not our problem. If they want to organize, we don't have to bargain with them. So the Teamsters kind of escalated by giving them a deadline to start bargaining of December 15th. Amazon is continuing to stonewall. So now the escalation is a strike. And these strikes one's in New York City, which is where I was this morning in Queens. There's another in Illinois outside of Chicago. There's one in Atlanta. And then there's 3 in California.
So these are DSPs, right? Like delivery.
Yeah.
Okay. So It seems like there are some legal issues that the Teamsters have with DSPs. I'm looking at freightwaves.com. It says Teamsters have some legal issues to overcome after wins at Amazon and with DSPs. Big questions. Is card check the same as a vote? Is Amazon a joint employer with delivery companies? This is, I feel like, a streamlined process of like, I'm going to use a word here that's silly, but the gigification of every aspect of the American economy, like all aspects of labor. And what are some of these complications in terms of like having coverage and being protected by the Teamsters?
Yeah, I mean, the gigification, in part, sometimes the intention, sometimes just a happy bonus, is that it makes it harder for workers to organize, right? They have all of a sudden these legal obstacles to overcome because they're technically not employees of the person that they really, it'd be fine if they wanted to bargain with these smaller DSPs, but the DSPs have no power. They respond to Amazon's needs, right? And we've seen this again and again where DSP owners themselves sometimes even go kind of nuclear against Amazon and say like, hey, we're on the side with the workers, but we don't set the times, we don't set the pay scale, all these things that show that it wouldn't make any sense to bargain with them. So the big thing here is, one, there's like the legal side, which the NLRB has been making moves to say that it agrees that Amazon should have joint employer status, which would make them have to bargain with these workers. But on the flip side, there's just the kind of the worker-led strategy, which is, NLRB, all well and good, legal obstacles, great, we'll work through them in the courts. But in the meantime, you just start acting like a union. And that's kind of what the Teamsters and these workers are doing right now, is they haven't had formal NLRB elections. They're still wending their way through these court objections and these hearings. And they're just saying, whatever, we need progress now. And we're going to act like a union and we're going to hold pickets and we're going to keep recruiting. And that's what I was seeing all morning was they're talking to their coworkers, many of whom were scabbing. It's not like every driver in these facilities is in the union. So these are escalations where you just act like a union and that makes you a union. So I think it's, in some ways it's a good thing. In other ways, it's really risky, right? Because if you have very few people participating, that can really be demoralizing for people.
Yeah. And then there's also potential repercussions, like you can get fired, and there's like less protection under the NLRB in terms of like what the companies can do, even though I guess it doesn't necessarily matter all that much, considering that even in instances like Starbucks, I feel like companies have directly found themselves in clear violation of the law. And my suspicion is, and I think you and I talked about this before, their goal here is to escalate this and turn it into a legal precedent that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the obviously Republican right-wing supermajority Supreme Court will side with corporations as they have done historically and will virtually gut the remainder protections that the NLRB offers to workers that want to unionize. Like you can't fire a worker directly for wanting to unionize, but I think that they want to destroy that as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say is they don't even care when there are legal protections. So it's interesting to see that there are no legal protections in this circumstance, and yet they're still choosing to engage in some kind of work stoppage.
Yeah, I mean, when you're pushed to the breaking point, you're just going to act and you're going to try to have dignity. I think it's worth saying that Amazon right now is one of the several companies that, yes, is challenging the constitutionality of the NLRB itself. It's an active case. It's worth mentioning because another person doing that is Elon Musk through SpaceX. His company also has, the NLRB found him liable for having violated some of his workers' rights. And so in response, he too is going all out, trying to undo the NLRB, which again has been around since the 1930s. I mean, it's incredible timing in that Jeff Bezos right now is at Mar-a-Lago. He was spotted having dinner with Trump.
Yeah.
So Trump's administration is very much, and some Democrats like Kristen Sinema and Manchin just ensured that Trump's NLRB will have a majority conservative Republican appointees. Any kind of good things the NLRB has been doing almost certainly will be undone very soon. And so it's really worth looking at, it's a small club and you're not in it, right? Like all these people are working together, and it's very, very obvious now that all these people are in on the same thing. And they're up against, again, these workers that are now the second most employees in the country as far as a company. So it's everybody against this handful of rich people who are openly collaborating now.
I wanted to also, in the interest of collaborating, I wanted to also talk about how the cops have been seemingly collaborating with big business in this circumstance. There was a lot of police presence, it seems, at the picket line this morning. I want to ask you what your personal experience was, but I want to briefly start by covering this part of it. From Labor on the Line, breaking: New York Police Department arrests Teamsters organizer and leader in attempts to break the strike of thousands of Amazon workers with Amazon Teamsters. One fact that I also wanted to bring up here for chatters who might not know is that the number of DSPs, these like contracted workers from Amazon's side, is, I believe, around 300,000. So it's not like a tiny, minuscule number of people. This is very clearly a important part of the Amazon logistics. Now that you have that understanding, so it seems like the cops are working and colluding with Amazon, doing their dirty work. I want to ask you, is this allowed? I want to ask you what's going on here, what you experienced as well here. Let's watch this video first, though.
Let Tony go! 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 Let Tony go!
The NYPD is arresting a lot of heroes lately.
Yeah.
They're really showing the contradictions.
And it's worth saying that's Antonio Rosario, he was in the 1997 UPS strike. He was a teenager back then. He was at UPS forever. He's now kind of an extremely respected Amazon. He's working on the Amazon organizing campaign. He's in local 804, which is the UPS local in New York City. He's a wonderful guy and a great organizer, and kind of, this people couldn't believe he was arrested. But in part, it seems to me like it's very obvious that he specifically was arrested because he's so much kind of a leader in these respects. But I want to say that two things. One, and yeah, you're pulling up the video now. The first arrest was this driver. So as I said, a lot of drivers are still just driving through, the picket line was a picket line, but every few minutes people would kind of open it to let one vehicle through and then reconstitute the picket line again. So this driver was one that was going through, but every time they would get stopped by the picketers, and the picketers would talk to them and the chant was put it in park. You know, people would try to convince them to join the picket line. This guy actually decided to join the picket line. So kind of a heroic thing that you always want. And as this video that I took shows, as he tried to join the picket line, first the NYPD literally tried to throw him back in the vehicle and put his seatbelt back on, like keep driving. And then when he insisted on coming out, they arrested him. And it's funny, you can see a sign, one of the picket signs says obey the law, speaking to Amazon, but there's the NYPD have no right to arrest someone for doing this. He has the right to be involved in this strike. You know, the picketers have no, Amazon is breaking the law by refusing to bargain with its own workers. And yet there's just one person under arrest here, and it's this driver.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty crazy.
I would say that, like, apparently from what I hear, in New York, it was particularly bad. I mean, the police very explicitly broke the picket line after several hours of a serious picket line. You know, after arresting Rosario, dozens of them, you know, they said they were going to arrest everyone if they didn't start letting vehicles through. They had no right to arrest everyone. People were on a publicly owned sidewalk. And yet it's very clear that, you know, people were asking me, why would they do this? The NYPD doesn't work for Amazon. And the answer is, well, maybe they do. And Amazon is very powerful in this city. So I'm curious what will result from that. But it was really remarkable to see the cops explicitly kind of protecting the flow of capital.
So, yeah, I have a question about that. Aren't cops also wage employees that also have a union, as a matter of fact?
Mm-hmm. They do have a union, but I wouldn't say they're workers like any other. I mean, you see, I always say when workers meet cops on the picket line, the cops are facing them, right? They meet them as obstacles to the picket line. The cop places themselves on the wrong side of history. And I think that's just naturally how we should see it. Cops always have been there to kind of protect the flow of business interests in this country. And it becomes very explicit in times like this where you see NYPD literally locking arms to ensure that Amazon's packages can get out. Usually it's not so obvious, but there's no question that when you look at these images that, you know, cops are not in the labor movement. They're meeting the labor movement as obstacles.
Yeah, it's confusing because I love cops.
Yeah.
And I thought that they were unionized employees, but it seems like they're holding hands here to demonstrate solidarity with the working class. What is happening here, if you don't mind me asking?
So the cops were forming these lines to ensure that they were starting to form lines to ensure that the vans could go through. It was early stages
Is
of
this
that.
guy wearing a loss prevention jacket?
Yeah, so Amazon's loss prevention people are the ones that basically were ensuring each car would go through. So they were like, it was the cops hand in hand with Amazon's operations team, ensuring that the vehicles would go through.
Interesting. So they weren't locking arms in unity with the picketing workers. It seems like they were locking arms to stop the picketing workers from stopping the delivery drivers from going into the facility.
That's correct. It was stopping the picketers from preventing the cars from going out of the lot.
So let's talk about the demands being made by DSP a little bit more, like by these striking workers a little bit more. What do the conditions look like for these guys in general, the people that are on the picket line, and what do they want?
Yeah, so the delivery drivers for Amazon that work for DSPs, you know, at this facility in New York City, they make about $22 an hour, which is not much in New York City. They generally deliver, you know, hundreds of packages per shift. So as you've probably seen, you know, Amazon drivers will hop out in the middle of the street and run up and drop off packages. They're very short for time, just like warehouse workers inside the facilities. They do very similar jobs to UPS drivers, which is why it kind of makes sense that the Teamsters are organizing with them. And I actually was speaking to one worker who's very much an active member of this union at that location in Queens. And he used to be a UPS driver. And he was like, I'm doing the exact same job and I have no benefits. I'm making like a quarter of what I was making at UPS. And it's completely ludicrous. They have no health insurance. That's another thing that is one of their key demands here. You know, this breaks their body. I spoke to one worker who's in the union who talked about being given, you know, faulty equipment that could have hurt her. And she was told, no, it was fine. It was her fault. And again, this is a young woman who had to carry these packages and had asked for equipment that would help her with that. So it's basic demands here. But right now, the strike isn't even about one particular thing like healthcare or more money. It's about literally having Amazon sit down and start talking to them. And Amazon
and recognizing them as like employees, you're saying, right? Because currently they're gig employees.
But it's not only that Amazon is refusing to do that for these drivers. Amazon is also still refusing to do that at JFK 8, where the employees are already their employees, right? There's no dispute that those workers who joined the ALU, which is now part of the Teamsters. There's never been a dispute that they are employees, and Amazon is still obstructing and trying to get out of having to bargain with them. They won that victory 2.5 years ago now. And so Amazon is obstructing workers, whether they're employees or not. So I think it's important to know that Amazon wouldn't act any different if these employees were differently classified. They have no interest in treating these people better.
Okay. So there is the Amazon driver, Jogernsyn Cardenas is the name. I'm butchering that. Has been freed. I wanted to hear what he had to say. Let's take a look.
Up earlier, so he's got a few words. Give it up for him, everybody. Give it up.
Thank you. Yo, we gotta keep it together so we can make it happen. That's the only way we're gonna make it happen.
Yes,
if not,
we wanna
whoever
make it happen.
don't wanna be here, keep it moving. That's so. We gotta be up.
What do you think about the media coverage surrounding this? Do you feel like there was appropriate coverage on these kinds of labor movements in general, like broadly from mainstream press?
I think we have over the past few years, and I'm sure you've seen this, gotten a lot more coverage of labor, and some of it is better. Though when I was looking at kind of the interviews, I looked at what Sean O'Brien was being asked on Fox Business today, and even on some more mainstream rather than right-wing publications. The focus is still always on how is this affecting consumers. Like, it was incredible. The TV host kept asking Sean O'Brien, but aren't you punishing consumers? What about Santa? How do you explain this to the American public? It's this belief that, again, like, workers are this separate group from the American public who presumably are all rich people who just order from Amazon and could never be affected by poor working conditions. And that is something that has been the case ever since the American labor movement was in decline, for the past half a century, that all of a sudden the news media presents workers as like this threat to you, the reader or the viewer. And I think we're still seeing that. And it's very obvious with this, even though, as much as I hate to say it, and I wish it weren't true, these strikes are not going to affect very many packages, right? These are 10,000 workers around total at 7 facilities out of hundreds of facilities and hundreds of thousands of workers that do this job. So while I wish it was more, it's a very small start to an organizing campaign. And yet you see this hysteria about like, how will people get their packages for Christmas? And so I think there's a long way to go. And there's a reason that a lot of these outlets don't, they're never going to change their coverage. They would rather these workers just shut up and let the capital flow.
Yeah, there's also the longshoremen union with a looming threat of a port strike that has the potential of happening as well. It says here that Trump again backs longshore union as a possible port strike. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because when the longshoremen did actually threaten to strike a couple months prior, there was a very similar commentary on this. They talked about the leader of the union and how wealthy he is and all this stuff. And one of the things that they engaged in their communications was just like being uncompromising and openly talking about Harold Daggett, openly talking about the importance of labor unions and the importance of the longshoremen in general, the dock workers, like the treacherous nature of the job, the harrowing conditions and how hard they work throughout COVID, for example, putting their lives at risk, putting their safety at risk without ever demanding anything else and generating a tremendous amount of profits. I feel like overall, Americans are very selfish people, and it's very hard to instill class solidarity amongst them. And it's very hard to even get them to recognize that they are in a very similar condition to these unionized workers. But it did feel like, given the power that the longshoremen had, given the power that the ILA had in completely shutting down American logistics, they were forced, the companies at least, were forced to concede to their demands, at least in the interim period. How do we get Americans broadly to understand that labor unions are good? I know this is a very difficult, this is the most complicated question of all time, but what do you think is effective?
I mean, the controversial answer here is that, as you said, with the ILA and the ILWU is the longshoremen union on the West Coast, you actually don't need the public to agree with you if you have the leverage. Like, this is a fight between you and your boss. And if you have the organization, you can force them to concede no matter how much they whine on the media and how much the public is up in arms. And that is good. It is why it's one of many reasons people talk about workers having the power, right? And I think there's something to be said about the idea that if and when, I would hope to say when, workers get more power in this country, there will be backlash. There are inconveniences to growing labor power. And it has to be, people like us are, of course, doing what we can, kind of like pushing this message, talking about why, it actually makes sense and is good for, say, longshoremen to have sustainable conditions rather than, I remember I was writing about the ILA strike. These workers were exhausted. They were not being safe. This is bad for everybody. But at the same time, it's really workers themselves who just, it's up to them and they don't really need you. Workers just have to get organized, and then they can force the boss to listen to their whims. That said, back in the day, Americans were pro-union. They're fairly pro-union now. And I think it, again, doesn't mean that much because they don't really see a lot of strikes and a lot of, organization yet. Though it's good, I'd rather they are that way than not. But in the past, when more Americans were in unions, new people in unions, saw that unions brought up wages across the board, both for union workers and for non-union workers, saw that it led to redistributive policies. It wasn't that hard to get them to be on board with it. So I think, sometimes it's just the media and the public opinion might follow the organizing in the workers.
Yeah. You brought up the concept of leverage, which is obviously the most significant aspect of this story. And I feel like it's important to recognize the timing of why these delivery drivers are striking. And it is because they have a maximum amount of leverage to show their worth in this moment, because holiday season is upon us. There's a lot more packages being shipped, Santa Claus and the like. Obviously, people are desperate to get their gifts in time. And I think this is a time for very high profits for Amazon, for most companies. Even Twitch streamers actually see additional revenue in the month of December because virtually every company is pumping ads into every platform, because this is when a lot of people consume. Would you say that they are taking advantage of the leverage and the additional need that Amazon has right now for extra helping hands?
Yeah. I mean, you want to maximize your leverage. When you want to strike, you want to, inflict economic suffering on your employer to try to force them to the table. And so, again, it was very funny watching, the Fox interview with Sean O'Brien where they said, couldn't you have waited? And it's like, that's a complete misunderstanding of how these things work. You want to do it when it's, most inconvenient for the employer, especially when you only have a smaller percentage of the workers. So, this is the time, and it, during these peak seasons, which come at a few times around the year, Thanksgiving and Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Prime Day, this holiday that Amazon itself made up and now has extended into several days. Like during these times, Amazon workers in the warehouses, their injury rates are something like 3 times what they usually are, which are already about twice as high as other warehouse workers. So these are peak times where grievances are also higher, where workers are pushed to their limits, where there's actually more reason and kind of more leverage and more excuses for workers to say to each other, hey, you know what, I'm actually sick of this and I'm now willing to listen to the idea of organizing. So there's many reasons you would do it now.
Yeah. Okay. Last question I have for you, by the way. Thank you so much, Alex, for giving us some time here. And this might come as a surprise to many in this chat, and certainly was a surprise to me. I am going to be talking to Sean O'Brien tomorrow because apparently the Teamsters have a podcast. What would you want me to ask him as a question when I go on his Teamsters podcast to talk to Sean O'Brien?
I mean, I guess one kind of complicated question I have for Sean is, he's been very vocally kind of praising Josh Hawley, this Republican kind of faux populist, faux pro-worker guy, as well as being kind of soft on Donald Trump.
Yeah.
These guys who very explicitly, I think, will put an end to the idea of Amazon being a joint employer. So these are politicians who very much in the next few years, I think, will quash at least the legal side of the Teamsters kind of arguments around bargaining with Amazon. To be clear, I think workers should and will organize anyway, but the legal landscape almost certainly will get harder. And Sean is yet kind of praising these guys, even as he represents these workers who they will make their lives a lot more complicated. And I'm just curious how he thinks of that. And if he agrees that that's the case, because Josh Hawley talks a good game. And he even the other day was advocating for joint employer status, even as he ensured that the NLRB will be conservative and, rule against it. So I think talk is cheap, actions speak louder than words. And these guys are, snake oil salesmen. And I would like to think Sean can see that. And maybe he's just politicking, but I think there are problems with that kind of politicking. Rubber is hitting the road, and that's for his members, for these workers who, again, have really tough jobs and really need every bit of serious help they can get.
Yeah, especially considering that there is a new leader of the NLRB that Josh Hawley voted for, it seems to me like a lot of these big corporations, ultimately they're hailing her as a champion of labor. And regardless of what you may think personally of the AFL-CIO, I think their scorecard is fairly decent in terms of like quickly interpreting whether or not this person is, or at least has a legislative track record of being pro-labor. And it seems like when your legislative track record of being pro-labor is at 10% from the AFL-CIO scorecard, I'm not exactly super stoked on, Trump's upcoming NLRB leader. So that is something that I'm interested in finding out about as well. What do you think is going to happen?
This is the new labor secretary that you're talking about.
Yeah, the new labor secretary. Trump is going to fire current NLRB General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo, who's done a tremendous job so far. I think far above my expectations from any Democratic administration, and replace Abruzzo with an acting general counsel who I believe has, let me pull the name
So
up
these
real
are two
quick.
separate jobs. So labber secretary is different than the NLRB general counsel. So
that's true. You're right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
As far as the NLRB, almost certainly Trump is going to appoint a corporate side lawyer. So that is, it will be a majority conservative corporate side. Even as, the NLRB's function, its mandate is to encourage. People are shocked when they read the language of the NLRA, the act that creates the NLRB. It says the act is to encourage collective bargaining. It's meant to actually aid and abet workers in organizing, not even just be neutral or something like that. And yet, under conservatives, you'll see management side attorneys trying to stop at all costs. So what I expect that things will get harder legally. I expect that, the backlash that's already been building, I mentioned the court cases from across the kind of quote unquote political spectrum. Trader Joe's also challenged the NLRB's constitutionality, which you would think, they're supposed to be this liberal progressive organization. I think we'll see more of that. And we'll see, last I checked, Trump's administration is going to have at least 9 billionaires. This is like Gilded Age, mask off, as clear as we've ever seen it. So I don't think you have to be very smart to see what's the writings on the wall. That said, you can't really put the energy back in the bottle when it comes to worker organizing. And we have seen that, especially young people. I mean, whether it's Starbucks, Amazon, whether it's the UAW workers that are organizing, both the auto workers and in white collar sectors, they're promising things to me. And workers really aren't going to give a they're going to keep doing what they have to do. Just like that worker today who got, who jumped out of his van because he didn't want to break a strike, and he got arrested. And, from what I heard when he got back on the picket line, he said he also had been fired for doing that. So this is somebody who needs that job, who has it a lot harder than a lot of people, and still is doing the right thing. So people will just do that no matter what the legal and political landscape looks like.
So what do you think about Lori Chavez de Remer, the labor secretary, and what that says for a potential NLRB pick from Trump?
So Lori Chavez de Remer, people celebrated her because she was better than other Republicans.
Yeah. And maybe even some liberals like Mark Kelly.
I think there were a couple things going on. One is people are just so desperate to own the libs and pretend that Donald Trump is pro-worker, that they seem to think it's worth saying that this person is pro-worker when she really is not. She joined the backing of the PRO Act, the big legal law reform bill, in part to get an endorsement from a local union for her reelection. And at a time when there was no chance it was going to pass. So it wasn't like she really was going to have to go through with it. And yet people want to be suckers, I guess, as far as political pundits go, and point at it and say, see, she's pro-worker. So I have very little expectations. The bar is on the floor and she is better than most conservatives. That doesn't mean anything when you have the ruling class actually now just completely mask off fully in power of every branch of the state. And even with her kind of the minimal pro-labor things she has to her name, very quickly Trump administration people, as reporting came out immediately after her announcement of being a nominee, immediately they were assuring business that was a little panicked that don't worry, there will be far more anti-worker people around her and in the NLRB and so on and so forth. That in fact, maybe this was just a PR move to get people off their back. and to ensure that people would kind of buy the idea that they aren't going to attack the working class. So I don't have high expectations. I'd love to be surprised. I just
so you are not a TYT adjacent believer in MAGA populism.
I am not.
Is what you're saying. Okay. Just wanted to see where everyone is standing on this, you know, in these trying times when people are confused about what's going on in the world of labor. You're not super enthusiastic about Trump's potential for being a pro-labor Republican.
As I said, it couldn't get more clear than Jeff Bezos currently being at Mar-a-Lago while his workers are on strike and while the NYPD are arresting them for engaging in protected activity.
Yeah, or the fact that Elon Musk is seemingly the shadow president and is like using Twitter as a bully pulpit to straight up bully anyone and everyone that even chooses to offer, you know, extra funds to natural disaster recovery or subsidies for farmers and the like. So it doesn't seem like things are going to turn for the better.
No, and it feels like it's rarely been easier to point that out than the way it is now.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. Just, you know, in closing, I want people to know that, you know, the strike is continuing. And if you live in any of these cities, please feel free to join the picket line. They certainly could use the reinforcements. I also, Hasan, you know this, was part of making this documentary about the ALU in Staten Island. Movie's called Union. And, you know, currently you can rent it online and the money goes towards the ALU strike fund. The ALU slashed, you know, their local one of the Teamsters. They may strike, they may join this strike soon. And so I encourage people to check out the movie and also donate to them.
Hell yeah. All right. Thank you, Alex Press. We look forward to your writing from this morning hasn't come out yet, has it?
It has not. No.
Okay. We look forward to reading it when it comes out. All right. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Hasan.
Bye.
Bye.
That was Alex Press. You can find her writing on Jogernsyn, sometimes even in the New York Times every now and then. So, yeah, I wanted to briefly touch on the ongoing labor activity. Every single distributor passed on the Union film today was shortlisted for the Academy Awards. By popular demand, Union's online release is extended throughout the holidays. You can rent it at unionfilm.com.